Hi, everyone. My name is Mastana Moradem, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the executive director here at Cross Cultural Expressions. And I'd like to welcome you here today on this series of 6 YouTube videos created by Cross Cultural Expressions in partnership with the Access for All, Deaf, Hard of Hearing, Blind and Physical Disabilities, Underserved Cultural Communities Subcommittee of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. During this 6-series YouTube series, we will be exploring a variety of topics related to the intersection of the deaf, hard of hearing, blind, partially sighted, visually impaired, and physical disabled individuals' lives as it relates to mental health, well-being, and the accessing of mental health services. This is an opportunity for members of these communities to sit together and discuss concerns, share resources, and give insight as to the work that can be done to keep individuals and communities uplifted and living their best lives. Before I allow my wonderful guests to introduce themselves, I wanted to make sure to share with everyone the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health's Access Helpline phone number. For mental health resources and support, please call the 24/7 helpline at 1-800-854-7771. Once again, that's 1-800-854-7771. So at this point, I would love for our 2 wonderful panelists to introduce themselves and also give us a little background about yourself and obviously your connection to the deaf and hard of hearing community. So I could allow whoever wants to go first to go first.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Héctor Ramírez. I am Chiricahua, Apache, and Mexican, and I am hard of hearing and autistic. I am a client to Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. I live here in Los Angeles with my family, and I've grown up here. I really want to welcome all of you. Definitely, today is for me is July, which is Disability Pride Month. So I'm really glad to be able to share space with all of you today. Definitely, our deaf and hard of hearing community is a big part of the disability community, and that's part of the connection that I have. I'm a lifelong person with a disability. I got my diagnosis earlier on in my life, and I didn't develop or acquire my hearing loss until much later in life, after I had been diagnosed actually with my mental health condition. It was during a time for my family when we were learning about resources to be able to assist me with my mental health condition and some of the needs that I had. There was one day, because of my medication, I was having a reaction, a seizure to it, and one of my neighbors, in good intention, ended up calling 911. And when they asked him what was going on, they said, my neighbor, something's going on. He has a mental illness, he said. And that immediately, for the response team, just meant send the police and the sheriff. And the sheriff showed up at my house, not knowing what was happening, under the impression that I was under drugs and violent, not really understanding at all that as a person with a disability, I was having a medical emergency. And he kept trying to grab me and handcuff me, and he ended up slamming me on the floor several times while trying to put the handcuffs on me. And he slammed me so hard that he ended up damaging my hearing severely, and I ended up getting very hurt. And it was the reaction. My family and I needed medical help, and the services weren't there, so law enforcement responded, and they were not at all prepared to even provide the service. And as a result, I ended up, now living with severe hearing loss. So I have hearing loss in both of my ears. I wear hearing aids, which are very expensive and very difficult to get. And for me, that was a big thing, because after having got some hearing loss, it was very difficult at times to be able to understand. I've been around deaf people all my life. I have a deaf aunt, and I grew up in an institution with other deaf and hard of hearing folks. But experiencing it and the way that it changed was different, because I would have trouble understanding sometimes what the conversations were, and I love to listen. So there were a lot of misunderstandings, and that created a lot of tension in my family, big tension in my family relationship at work. But I didn't realize that it had a significant mental health linkage as well, because I thought I was becoming more disconnected from my family. Sometimes I thought I was hearing things or not hearing things. And so I thought it was an additional mental health, change that had happened to me, but not realizing that it was the hearing aids that I needed. And my hearing aids, it's progressing. So I'll be acquiring deafness later on. And so that for me is a transition into the deaf community. But it's, as a disabled person, that's where my community is. It's just another intersection. And I am active with the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health to bring awareness to all of our folks with disability, but particularly our deaf and hard of hearing. We've struggled to get services, captioning, sign language services. Right now, we don't even have service providers that are deaf. And so Los Angeles County has one of the largest deaf and hard of hearing populations in the country, but yet we don't have any public service mental health providers at all for our folks. And that has significantly gotten worse because it was already bad before the pandemic. And after the pandemic, that became even harder. But we're very active in our community, even though I say we're a big community, we're not that big, 10 million people in LA County, but we're still one of the largest populations. And so I'm really glad that we're able to do this. And I'll pass it on to DeMarco.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, you touched on so many different things that I want to definitely get into and expand on in our time here today. So thank you so much for that, Hector. I appreciate it. DeMarco, yes, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
So now I'm going to give my background information. As you can see, let me tell you about what I look like for the deaf and blind, for the blind community. I have on a black shirt, black glasses. My background is blank. I've got on a watch that's black, and it's also have a silver band. My name is DeMarco. My last name is Pittman. I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I have generational when it comes to Native American with Black and Native American. That's also in my family. But when it comes to disability, that's been a generational thing also with deafness. But when it came to mental health, that came at the age of 6 after I lost my parents. Didn't necessarily have a good history and, relationship when it came to having mentors. There were none available. So there were a lot of frustrations, a lot of downers, and a lot of just negative things that were happening through that time. But of course, made it through, and, with life and oppression and language deprivation and, the issues with being told that I couldn't do a lot of things and those oppressions, but having to fight through that, and knowing that the success behind that was what has happened, because I did graduate high school and then I went on to college from there. And then, once I graduated from college, I'm actually here for the mental health, and because mental health did happen and it did impact, and we know because of COVID also that became a worse situation. And mental health is a tough, very tough, strenuous situation. And as far as the young individuals, they're not able to learn at a young age, for an example, when it comes to the new deaf community and using Zoom, they don't even really like to even use that or approach a person through, especially when it comes to speaking. There's just so many different ways oppression has happened to our deaf community, and it's continued to happen.
Again, you talked about so many things that I'd like to explore more today, so thank you for being here. I think I'd like to start off to really
Thank you.
ask, thank you, to ask each of you, what is the prevalence? And maybe you want to talk about your individual experience, and then also, obviously, with the work that both of you do around advocacy for the deaf and hard of hearing communities, you can expand it to others as well. But what is the prevalence of people who are experiencing deaf and hard of hearing to also be experiencing mental health conditions? And I'd like to add to that, what are some of the obstacles and hurdles for someone who is deaf and hard of hearing to access mental health services within their communities? You could talk about your personal experience or a broader experience as far as the work that you have done.
Okay, I would like to speak. This is DeMarco speaking. I have experienced this, but it's been a long time related with this. And it's no surprise also as far as solving, because deaf people like to give up because of that language deprivation. And then of course, mental health is added on there. Either they say, I can't do something, and that's a quick response. And the reason is because our deaf, as far as our community, we're all upon each other. And then we have to have just that one, who may just only just support us. But even just when it comes to work, I've even noticed, even at events or something, maybe in the community, they feel like, oh, everything is good to go. But inside, they're not okay. You know what I mean? So this just, you have to just be honest whenever that may happen. You don't want to put that disguise on and think and say, oh, I'm okay, because we'll think, that you're fine, because everyone has mental health. But then they say, we'll blame it on COVID-19 and things like that. But no, truly, it's a historical thing. It's been happening since the beginning. Here's an example here. There's one person who themselves, are they blaming is specifically one issue? No, they're going back to history. Maybe it had to do with their parents being gone, or the trauma that happened in the past life. There's a bigger vision, not only just this one small thing that happened with COVID. Yes, then we have to go through life after that, but you have to diagnose what happened before that. So that's just the kind of the vision and the people that's kind of happened in our community. They're quick to give up for any little reason, but it's just like, you really have to take that time, go back and really figure out that visionary thing, and then figure out what happened in the past that's connecting to mental health, and not focus on this one thing like COVID. But that's just something that I wanted to speak on. Thank you.
You mentioned, DeMarco, that you lost your parents when you were 6. And am I correct to say that?
Excuse me, that was the interpreter, not parents, grandparents.
Oh, okay. You lost your grandparents when you were 6. And was that?
Okay, let me clarify, please. Excuse me. My grandfather, he passed away at my age of 6. But let me clarify why this is a big emphasis in my life. Because he was deaf himself, and he was the one who really was connected and close to my heart in my life. So yes, that's why I say that happened at the age of 6. My grandfather passed away.
Oh, I see. And is that when you also experienced your own hearing loss? Was when he passed? Did I understand that correctly?
So let me clarify that. It happened in August of 2006. My mental health, my mind, it all just completely changed. It seemed like everything was completely impossible. He was my mentor. He taught me Black Sign Language, BSL. He was just such a great, strong mentor. He was my father figure. But then when he died, I was like, what happens? You know, where did he go? My parents, yeah, but my grandfather, he was the one. So that's kind of what started my mental health. And to clarify the question you were asking about, when DeMarco, when did you become deaf? Was it when your grandfather died or before that? I see. No, I was born deaf. So I was born deaf. It was a generational natural thing. That's what I was mentioning about my grandfather. It was a generational history related with deafness. So yes,
I can
that's correct.
now understand how that could be so impactful, because I imagine your grandfather being deaf and you being born deaf, that uh, that must have been a very strong relationship.
Exactly. The two of us had a very strong relationship. He was just like name in the stars, you know what I mean? Very strong relationship and grandfather for me. He was a mentor. If I could ever mention anybody who was a mentor or a father figure to me, it was him. And now that he is gone, I'm like, well, who else is there? Who else is going to be that father figure mentor for me? That he was just truly special to me.
So I want to follow up with that. When, as such a young child, you experience such a significant loss, and to add to that, what you were talking about, you know, the not being able to, um, you know, speak because of the deaf and hard of hearing. So how were you able to access mental health healing? Were your parents able to set that up for you, or were there friends and family who really helped you through that process?
Okay, yes. Yes. Um, my parents, they're deaf as well. I will say that, yes. Yes, but let me clarify now. My grandfather, when he passed away, the last comment that he said before he died, he said, never give up. He signed that to me. And I kept that in my mind. I was at 6 years old at that. And I continued to have that, never give up. You know, lucky, you know, my parents, they'll say, you know, never give up, of course. But then, I'm sorry, my grandparents said never to give up. But of course, that day, my grandfather, he passed away in the hospital. And I automatically became depressed. And my parents, they were to support me. But at this time, those words from my grandfather were so strong, and that was what was worthy and worth to me. That never give up, and what I needed to do. You know, I felt alone. Of course, yes, I felt alone. I started that when it came to communication, I was just more just alone and isolated because my grandfather, that was our relationship. He was the one I went to, and he's, you know, passed away. And of course, because we had that same language, that Black Sign Language, it's not American Sign Language. Let me clarify. My first language was Black Sign Language, you know, and that was our communication. And now we don't have Black Sign Language communication between me and my grandfather. Of course, in elementary school, I did learn later on ASL, but how, as far as that connection, that was it. And for some reason, okay, there we go. I'm sorry about that. I had froze for a second, but it was the connection that did that, and just how our relationship grew, and what he taught me, and with that being passed around. I truly had a group. I did have good support from my parents. I did. I don't want to say that, but my grandfather was my father figure.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. Hector, I want to come back to what you had shared about, obviously, that what sounded just like a horrifying experience with the police coming when you really needed the ambulance to come. And then having experienced the hearing loss a little bit later in life, And I would love if you could talk a little bit about, the mental health challenges that came with experiencing that loss. I imagine when being deaf is something that you're born with, that maybe you somehow get used to it because you don't know any other lifestyle. But when you experience that later on in life, I wonder if there is some additional feelings of loss that come about. So if you could speak to that.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, DeMarco, for reminding me. I didn't do a visual description of my background, so I'll do it really quickly. So in my background, I have the new disability pride flag. And so it has the striding colors. It's not so bright. And then I'm wearing a red shirt for the United Farm Workers, which is one of my favorite organizations. And I am about 47 years old, and I have a ponytail that is tied back. But yeah, disability, it's a way of life. We're born with it. We acquire new ones. We adjust. And so for me, I didn't realize just how severe the hearing loss had become until I got the hearing aids. And I was like, wow. It's like, oh wow. It's like I can hear a lot of stuff that I didn't realize I wasn't hearing anymore. There was definitely anger to losing this, but then there was also definitely depression, because because I understood whenever I would go to restaurants or family gatherings, I was really struggling, really struggling to follow along and asking, can you repeat that again? Or like, what did you say? Or like, did you really say that? And it became such a big issue that I started isolating. And when family were having events, I didn't want to go. I did not want to go. I did not, and it had a significant impact. I didn't want to go to family events, to the movies, to lunch with them, because I couldn't hear them. And I felt both left out, and I also felt dumb because I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't know how to fix it. And I just started to really internalize it, and I resented them, and I didn't understand, but it's because of the lack of accommodations out there, or the lack of awareness of making places accessible. And so a lot of the frustration that I was also feeling was not just about what I had lost, but about what really wasn't out there, to make spaces inclusive or accessible to folks. And it just became more apparent. And it really was very much like giving up. It was too much. I was already struggling with things. I didn't want an extra thing to deal with. And it had, my workplace, I couldn't work. I was struggling. I couldn't get accommodations for work. And so I was stuck at home, not really being independent. And I did feel like life was interrupted, or just stopped, not paused, but stopped. And so I really had to kind of, rely on my disability community again, how we work to make things accessible, because we're the ones that have to take care of ourselves sometimes at the end, because there's not a lot of stuff out there. And, but I mean, it's depression, anxiety, the microaggressions, like what now that we know what microaggressions, or when things are inaccessible, we know that they have an impact. This is traumatic on you, and it's compounding. Every single time you have those experiences, it doesn't make you stronger. It actually makes it harder to keep doing or asking for things. And, me as somebody that was actively engaged in my mental health treatment, going to my doctors, taking medications, engaging in my system of care, I couldn't do that anymore. And it was really frustrating and defeating, because I couldn't get accommodations to go see my psychiatrist. especially during the pandemic, that was even more evident during the pandemic where everything was remote. And we all had a lot of significant stresses during COVID. I worked nonstop because I was helping with the state response, but for our meetings, so like I help at the state level to develop the vaccine and the housing and all that stuff. And we had captioning and services, and I was able to really help for that. But when I would try to talk to my psychiatrist, at the beginning, we didn't even have like a remote platform. And then when we got it, we had no captionings. So I couldn't understand. And before that, all my option was just calling by phone. And it's very, very challenging to begin to have a mental health conversation because the words are not always there. And it's even more challenging when you are using assistive technology, other captioning or sign language interpreters for a whole range of issues. Sometimes accessing mental health services really was difficult because of technical issues with the internet. And I, as a disabled person, I've been using remote platforms before the pandemic, so I was used to, but the world wasn't ready for it. They weren't really providing captioning and stuff like that, and it became it became a battle of survival to ask for accommodations during the pandemic. Our CART and ASL interpreters became our essential workers, just like our nurses and doctors and other frontline workers were, because we were stuck at home and we depended really a lot on them to be able to connect with the outside now like the rest of the world. So it was really, really hard. Definitely for almost 3 years not to be able to access direct mental health services. And I'm glad that we have medication, but that's just like one single pill. I mean, one single factor in dealing with mental health conditions, because like DeMarco noted, it's not just, the biological or the inherent things, it's the environmental and the generational things. As a person of color during this pandemic, as a disabled person, it was even harder to survive during the pandemic because there was all this violence and discrimination that we were facing outside, that even asking for help was dangerous, and we saw that for our deaf and hard of hearing folks during the pandemic, where they would call 911 or they would try to get services, and because there weren't accommodations there, they either didn't get the service or law enforcement sometimes would be the only ones that would show up. And because of the lack of accommodations, we saw here where I am, a lot of our deaf and hard of hearing folks being traumatized, hurt. Some of them got shot. And, one of our deaf folks ended up getting paralyzed because he was signing and the law enforcement didn't know what it was. And he thought the person was being agitated, and so the lack of accommodations, for our community are an integral part, not just to communicate, but an integral part of how we access mental health services. Having sign language interpreters that are not only certified, but have experience with mental health terminology, or being able to explain it in a non-stigmatizing way is so important. But then also the cultural parts of the deaf and hard of hearing community, like Black sign language. In my family, we use native sign because we have some deaf native people, and so we have native sign, which is totally different from American Sign Language. Our traditional in our home, English is not our first language. Neither is Spanish or sign language. It's like one of four. We speak our traditional language at home, and it's mixed in that. So, it really highlights as well how a one fit approach to accommodations doesn't help anybody, because even in the disability community, we have a lot of very rich cultural and ethnic diversities, that are very important to maintain, but they don't really exist or is an accommodation for that in the Western medical model. So when we're trying to access things like mental health or any type of medical services, in which we rely on the narrative, like describing what's wrong with us, and even describing how we want to fix it, feel better, is very difficult if the communication is not there. And so that adds to the frustration. And many of us sometimes don't even want to go back to mental health services because the frustration and the battles of even getting the accommodations can be even more daunting than some of the things as to why we're trying to go there. Did that explain or
Oh,
did I?
beautifully,
Yeah.
beautifully. Thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about, uh, we're talking about getting the accommodations and the accessibility and a lot of times the discrimination that goes along with that. So I was wondering if either of you can talk a little bit about issues around ableism with me.
Hi, this is DeMarco. I sure can speak on that. Yes. I'm actually very angry behind it. Everyone has, I forgot as far as how it goes, but everyone has, as far as when it comes to palm and the printing and whatnot. Let me see how I can say this. I'm frustrated. Just that's bottom line. I am frustrated. Every day, it's never missed. So say, okay, here's an example. Say we're in the hospital, and I'll say, as far as with getting an interpreter, they'll say, well, let's just write back and forth. No, I need an in-person interpreter. Oh, they'll say, no, I have the VRI system, the technology. I'm going to be honest with you. I hate the VR system because in that building, in the hospital, the Wi-Fi, it's not good. So then it's frustrating. And then so there's a lot of freezing that happens, especially during that time. And then it's just, having to kind of just say, hold on, the interpreter will say, oh, wait a minute, hold on, the doctor is speaking, and point over there and kind of interrupt when somebody else is speaking. But then they'll forget as far as when it comes to those laws, they are breaking the law. It is printed. That is what I was trying to say earlier. Excuse me. It is printed, the law. And it's very frustrating. For years and years of my life, at the time, just still continuing to see this rebellion and stubbornness happening related to the deaf, blind, and hard of hearing community. We're a growing community, and we're continuing to be oppressed and discriminated against. When it comes to jobs, oh no, you can't write, you can't see. But wait a minute, I do have skill. Where's it at? I have hands. I'm a human. Everything, I'm physically fine. I'm beautiful. Make it happen. So it's frustrating. That is the true point that I want to make, that it's frustrating, because if someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, maybe they're going out, maybe they're the best actor or actress, and they'll go out for the role, and so but then they'll be approached as far as when it comes to accessibility. Oh, you're deaf? This is in the meeting or something. You're deaf, but how are we going to go through this? But no, it's still like we can still go with the conversation. There's no issues, especially when it comes to movies for deaf people. Oh my God, I feel like it's just a complete insult. The movies, acting, theater, and then as far as with deaf, I just feel like it just looks bad. It's not the same access as far as what comes to hearing people. And the movie, honestly, that there's just so many just issues that are happening when it comes to discrimination and oppression in the deaf and hard of hearing, deaf, blind, and blind community. And inside, I'm frustrated because it's been just year after year after year. So that's my response.
Thank you for that. Hector, did you want to add anything?
Well, this is Hector. It's daunting on me because, like Marco mentioned, we have federal civil rights laws, and now with everything that is happening with the Supreme Court, we worry about what that really means for the disability community, because things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, that is over 30 years old, really, I mean, it's a great law, but it really has not really had a lot of enforcement, and there's many reasons for that. One, I think it's financial one,
And
because
democracy structure.
nobody, while we fought to get those rights, the funding to enforce those is a whole different thing. And so one of the reasons that we don't see a lot of accommodations out there is because the services that we need haven't been built into the environment. They're kept as an extra when somebody needs them. And as a result of that, we're not able to really ensure that our frontline staff, like our sign language interpreters, are very well paid, that we have a large pool, and that a lot of folks know how to access them. And a lot of companies think that when they have to provide accommodations, it's like an immediate service. It's like a big cost because it's like an on-demand sort of thing. But if it was built into the environment, not only is it more sustainable, but it's accessible to everybody else. Because accommodations are actually universal, and they serve a variety of functions. The first one is inclusivity. It makes it so that more people are able to access something. And like captions, we use captions for a lot of things now, not just for deaf and hard of hearing community. Sign. Did anybody see the Super Bowl this year? I did. And we had ASL included in there. And when we had it here in LA, it was like the beginning of like really starting to really highlight that. And it wasn't. You did?
Can I add a comment, please, if you don't mind? I want to just give my honest opinion. When it comes to the Super Bowl, I just have a feeling and comments related to that, because it's separate. When it comes to TV, of course, everything is be seen. But behind scene, when it comes to the deaf and hard of hearing community, we can't see anything. That's not really inspiring, as far as having that interpreter. And now if TV is on large, how can the deaf and hard of hearing community be able to see the interpreter? Because the interpreter's on an app on a separate screen. So we have our videos that's on here with the deaf and hard of hearing, or with the interpreter, excuse me. And then we have the football game on another screen. We're having to go back and forth. It's not natural. We need one system. I'm just not impressed when it comes to that Super Bowl. I'm sorry, I have to be honest. I'm not impressed with that. They're on national TV, come on. And then they work as far as in that area that needs to be improved with providing those accommodation services.
Oh, no, I agree with you on what you just said. And I was getting to that. Because like when we had it here in Los Angeles for the first time with the new stadium, it was done like that. And it was almost like they were showing it to kind of, it wasn't really accessible, because I remember you had to have a different app to watch it. And then when you're there in person, it's like a separate section far away, not on the big screen. This new game that we just had, I think they ended up putting the sign language interpreter on the screen. It's like they're learning, But what I liked about that is that it brought more awareness to the inclusivity factors and how easy it can be done. Yes, there's a lot of room for improvement. There's 30 years left of improvement that needs to be done. But what I liked about having it there is that it was a global platform that has allowed us to really push the conversation, because we want to ensure that inclusivity happens there, because it isn't there. And not having it everywhere has a significant mental health impact on you, because when you don't have accessibility in places, the message that you get is you are not welcome here. this is not for you. And that affect, there's like racism is, mental health conditions are like the symptoms of what's happening to us, but not, we don't know what's causing them. We never really address it. We address the symptoms. Racism and discrimination causes people significant mental health harm. And I'm preaching to the room here, you know, it's like we have had laws to prevent racial discrimination. So we know now that we don't go into a place that says only whites. We know that's unacceptable. We don't go into a place that says women not allowed here. We don't put up with that. But for some reason, even though people with disabilities are protected class, like people of color and women, people don't feel the same way when they go into a place and they realize, oh, people with disabilities are not allowed in here. People should have that same type of guttural reaction to not having inclusive spaces like we do to spaces that discriminate based on gender or religion or color, just like we do with all those things. But again, we have been kind of forgotten at the bottom of the priorities, even though we were part of the civil rights movement, and we are to this day. Disabled people make up the majority of the population. You don't believe me? Let's talk about COVID. COVID impacted everybody in one way or another, particularly mental health. Whether you have adjusted to it or you're still struggling with that, that's a mental health, that's a disability experience that you have had or still have. And I think that might give us an opportunity to continue pushing the envelope, but ultimately it comes back to enforcing our civil rights and making sure that there's equitable funding to ensure that those services are there. Just like we ensure that there's funding for, or that there's no funding taken away from education for people of any color, or just like we are working to ensure that the workplaces are safe for women and other, for everybody, the same thing has yet to happen for people with disabilities, you know? And it's a constant struggle that all of us are we're forced to do just by living. We wake up with our disabilities, and at that point we have to figure out, oh, what am I going to do today? Am I going to need supports or services to do what I need to do, and how do I get them? Most people don't think about those things, you know, and it's exhausting, but it's also sometimes rewarding when you go into a place and you've done advocacy and you go in there again and you don't need to do that anymore because it's already built into it. And that's when a place really starts feeling safe. That's where you can finally begin to kind of address some of the things that you're trying to do, because you're not battling that issue of ableism, of, you know, one of the things that I've become more aware about now is, you know, just being people that can hear are privileged, you know, and they don't realize that sometimes either having hearing loss or being deaf has a different type of privilege that hearing people take for granted. Interrupting, talking soft, you know, not looking at somebody when you're talking to them so the sound doesn't come clear, talking to somebody from a different room when you can't see them or can't quite hear, things like that. And there's a term for that. It's like autism. You know, people that can hear, they don't realize that because of privilege, they discriminate or they perpetuate an environment. And accessibility really takes us more into a place of equity that I think that after COVID, it should be clear that that's what we all want. We want to live in an equitable society where the most impacted folks and the most marginalized and disenfranchised have to be uplifted, and people with disabilities are those folks. You know, but it's weird because that's not what you went to therapy for. But you can get me rambling because it is very frustrating and angering.
And I definitely hear the frustration and anger that both of you are speaking about, and I'm so glad that you're here today talking about it, not only for the folks that are watching this who are experiencing the same levels of frustration and anger that you are, but also for those who are taking that for granted and not recognizing where your anger is from. You know, I think a lot of it for those who do have, who are able to hear and who live in a world that's made for them, don't really recognize a lot of times what those who live in a world that isn't made for them essentially are going through. So, as we wrap up this segment, I wanted to ask both of you, in a perfect world, what would true accessibility look like? If you were able to create the perfect world for the deaf and hard of hearing community, what would true accessibility look like?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. I've done some thinking on it, but let me tell you, in a perfect world, it would be focused on the young deaf and hard of hearing, blind, disability, younger generation. So how to make them perfect as far as making their world, making their world perfect, as far as having those leaders and guiders, those teachers, mentors, already have those where they can. Let me give you an example. Here's my example. So someone who may be deaf and hard of hearing and they're getting a lot of resistance and they're maybe in the same old place, people have their same ideas and concepts of them. But as far as a deaf person, they'll see, they can see a change to have that exact access, that perfect access to make that happen as far as their skills. Even if they are deaf and hard of hearing, there may still be that resistance, that same old, same old, same old. Is frustrating, and we definitely want to be able to make sure that the world looks good, so there's full access.
So, can you give me an example, DeMarco? What would true accessibility look like for a deaf or hard of hearing person who's seeking mental health services? What is it that in an ideal world you'd like to see
Okay.
happening from the
Okay.
moment they first reach out to, getting services and so on?
The priority would be to make sure that there is a deaf mental health specialist there. When it comes to a therapist, that is what's needed. Especially if someone who is Black, it'd be preferred to have a Black specialist who is also deaf and matching that same culture. But that is a need to have a Black, deaf mental health therapist, counselor, psychologist, however it may be. That would be the priority. Then secondary after that would be a school for institution, as far as maybe mainstreaming into a school. What would be the best accessibility for that individual? As far as myself, I grew up in the mainstream community. So maybe that might be overwhelming for someone. As far as going and working at a deaf institute, they're able to see what's going on and actually have their priority with a deafness. But if they're mainstream, there needs to make sure that there's full accommodations, that there's no missing parts when it comes to the education. Then, of course, the mental health therapist, like I mentioned, needs to be someone that's Black and deaf. That's definitely needed more. Someone we can truly look up to, saying, wow, my therapist is a Black mental health therapist. That's just something to look up for and look up to. So that's my thoughts and idea behind that.
So I know that some places have ASL interpreters to sit with the therapist and the client. Does that feel like appropriate accessibility?
You know what?
Someone who is ASL themselves who's the therapist.
Let me explain what I'm saying. I have a therapist now, mental health. And let me just get the best words to say. I'm not satisfied. And let me tell you why. The hearing individual will add in, their little extra tidbit of resources. And I'm thinking, like, here's an example here. If it's someone who's deaf to deaf, they're completely experienced with the same language, same culture. It's a complete connection. But if it's hearing to deaf, they're and then plus an interpreter, where's the connection at? That is my approach when it comes to therapy. I feel like I do agree that it's getting better, but priority, it should be a deaf mental health therapist signing straight to the other deaf individual so that there's a full connection and a complete understanding. But if it's a hearing to deaf, there's one understanding for as far as the deaf perspective of their individual understanding, but then the hearing person will get their perspective and throw in their ideas, and then the interpreter, there's just there's misinformation. The resources and then and the method for deaf, it needs to stop. Do you understand what I'm saying as far as okay, so I'm gonna be honest, I quit therapy. It was not working for me. It wasn't. That's just simple as that. It just was not working for me. So
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me because coming as a person from, a different culture who spoke a different language and working with clients that speak different languages, whenever you try to use an interpreter to do therapy from language to language, you're losing so much of what's necessary for that therapeutic relationship to work.
exactly.
So it makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. Hector, same question. In your ideal world, what would accessibility look like for someone who's deaf and hard of hearing?
I thought I had an answer, but it's weird because I whenever I try to think of that, there's like all this like frustrating negative experiences come up, and like how would I resolve this? It's like, okay, well, I think part of it, and you mentioned it, Amancha, you mentioned kind of like the parallel. It is a cultural element that has to be included and respected, like all of our other cultures in this American society that we have. And that really means making things inclusive from the bottom up, starting with children, making sure that there's, those services earlier on, investing in services in the system so that they are across the lifespan of the individual when they need them or as they use them, but then also have it built not just into the laws, but into the budgets, because I think one of the things that has happened is that while it is required in many settings to provide accommodations, it is not required that the funding be there to provide those accommodations. And so contractors are usually having to be faced to pull out of their budget to provide for something that hasn't been allocated for. And that causes a variety of issues. First of all, there's that resentment that is eating out of their purse. Second, sometimes they'll go for the lowest services that they can afford, sometimes because the services haven't been properly built into the system. It's very difficult to find good services or to find services at all. And as a result, that has caused a lot of inequities in that particular implementation. We had solutions to gender discrimination because it was changed that if anybody violated that it would affect their budgets. Title VIII, similarly for racial things, but we haven't done something similarly in the disability field. We have done it. You see it more, for example, for children, where you have like their IEPs that mandate certain services. But then after somebody turns 21, that legal mandate to make sure that those services are funded is not there. And our disabilities don't end when we become adults. In fact, we need accommodations more to be able to be included in to be able to exercise our right as voters, to be able to work if we want to live where we want to get the health services that work best for us, that we choose, but right now we don't have those things. So it's very difficult to think of an ideal society. First of all, as a disabled person, I've never lived in that. As a man of color, I've never lived that. So I don't even know what that means, besides not having to continue ask for something that is already there. And in a perfect world, I think in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to put our lives on pause to figure out, I think that really, that movie, Girl Interrupted, that it makes sense. It makes sense. I think in a perfect world, I wouldn't have to pause to reconnect.
Beautiful. Beautifully said. And thank you so much for your patience to help us at least get these words and these messages out in this imperfect system. So my gratitude to you both. And if you can please, both of you, stay for the second segment, because I want us to definitely continue our conversation. But at this time, I would like to thank our wonderful speakers for giving their time and wisdom and being here today. I want to remind everyone that if you are in need of mental health resources and support, you can call the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health's Access Helpline at 1-800-854-7771. I also want to invite you to listen and watch our podcast episodes, which we have a series of Access for All podcast episodes, as well as the other YouTube episodes on our Access for All YouTube series of programs, all of which address the topics of mental health and wellness as it relates to the deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and physically disabled communities. For links to podcast and YouTube videos, feel free to reach out to Cross Cultural Expressions by emailing us at connectwithcce@gmail.com, or you can also find links by going to our website at crossculturalexpressions.org. Thank you all so much.